Hello everyone. Welcome to the lecture on spatial interaction, distance, decay, and time-space compression. Spatial interaction refers to the relationships between places. That relationship may be an economic relationship in which there is a supply and a demand, and therefore the potential for trade, or it may have other relationships. You may have read about Waldo Tobler's first law of geography. Tobler said in 1970, everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. With this in mind, he means that as you change distance or as you move away from a place, things are going to get different, and this is no surprise. Well, we also have something called the gravity model, or the concept of distance decay. Distance decay refers to how the level of spatial interaction between any two places is inversely proportional to the distance between them. That's a little more formal than Tobler's first law of geography, but essentially they're the same thing. Here's an example. In the case of religious culture in the United States, distance decay is apparent by the county population of people who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, otherwise known as Mormons. LDS members, as a share of the total county population, generally shows that the closer you are from Salt Lake City, Utah, the more likely you are to be a Mormon. One of the concepts associated with spatial interaction that I'm particularly fond of as a historical geographer is the idea of time-space convergence, sometimes called time-space compression. The idea of time-space compression is the process by which technology makes distant places converge in terms of transport and communication time. In other words, things get faster and faster over time. Technology generally reduces what we call the friction of distance between places. Friction of distance is also mentioned in your textbook. Spatial interaction, therefore, increases over time. Spatial interaction increases as the friction of distance is reduced, and the friction of distance is reduced by technology. To me, this is the single most important process of globalization. Globalization is all about speeding things up and interacting faster. Here's a diagram that sort of explains this concept of time-space compression. The compression of geographic space by means of faster transportation and communication. If you go back to the days of early European colonization of the world and exploration, they didn't move very quickly. The faster way of moving was by water, and even that wasn't very quick. During the mid-19th century until pre-World War II, the speed of movement over land increased, and we began to finally see air travel. But still, this travel was quite slow. And if you're referring to the movement of information, then information flow still wasn't very quick until we have mail service by air, and eventually travel sped up in the 1950s and 1960s with jet aircraft for passengers, which move generally around 450 to 500 miles per hour. And today, of course, since about the mid to early 1990s, through email and eventually the World Wide Web, we have cyberspace, and so instantaneous communication, and increasingly instantaneous and cheap communication through things like cellular networks and use of video phone over the internet. So communications and transport costs tend to fall with time. Let's look at an example that we might be familiar with here in Oklahoma. In the 1700s, in the colonial era, the production of wheat was centered in places like the Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts and the Hudson Valley of New York. the wheat belt actually began in the Northeast. And can you imagine cutting wheat with hand tools and farming with oxen or horses? This is what it was like. Now, wheat had a market even in Europe, and in the let's say around 1790, 1800, American wheat farmers were actually exporting wheat after the Revolution. And moving it to market kind of illustrates the process of time-space compression. So if you were to cut your wheat crop and thresh it and bag it and haul it to market, you were pretty limited because the roads were bad and you probably had to move it by horse or ox cart. So you're going to be limited to the volume of grain that you can haul to market. Once you got it to market, you would probably haul it to a port facility, and at that port facility the grain would be put onto a cargo ship of some sort. And around 1800, more than likely, this was going to be a sailing vessel that would be fairly limited on the amount of cargo that it could carry. So spatial interaction was limited by technology. Move into the mid-1800s, maybe after the Industrial Revolution, maybe 100 years or so. And here we have an example from the probably the late 1800s, early 1900s of grain being threshed out in the field with a steam-powered thresher, bagged up and hauled to town on a horse cart, typically, after it's bagged, and then put onto into a box car that would be taking it to a port facility. And the steam locomotive was probably the type of movement that the type of power that you had on that rail transport, which could get up to maybe 50, 60 miles per hour in some places. So it was quite speedier than an ox cart. And then once the grain got to the port, it was loaded onto a steam-powered cargo ship, something like this, which couldn't hold too much. So you had a limited amount of a market. Move into the current day, into the 21st century, our farm implements and our tractors and our farms themselves are huge, and we can produce enormous amounts of wheat or grain compared to 100 years ago. The grain is cut and threshed in the same combine, in the same piece of machinery, and put into a grain truck. The grain trucks are then shipped, or the grain trucks take it off to perhaps a grain elevator, where maybe it's hauled by freight train at fairly high speed to a port facility and loaded onto a very large ship, which then hauls gargantuan volumes of grain worldwide in a matter of just a few weeks. So the volume has changed, the speed has changed, the price has changed. All of these things are interactions, and they're associated with spatial interaction and time-space compression. The idea that technology speeds things up, it allows for much larger volume and therefore cheaper prices. This concludes, and this is obviously a photo out of your textbook that shows a container ship port, and you'll see more about this when we get into the subject associated with agriculture and shipping. Thank you for listening. This has been Spatial Interaction.